Welcome to today's episode where we are joined by Mary Jane Woodger and Mark Ogletree to discuss their new book, Celebrating the Newly Renovated Salt Lake Temple. In our conversation, they share captivating stories that highlight the temple's unique history and the deep affection it inspires among members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We explore both the original construction and the recent remodeling of this sacred edifice, gaining fresh insights that can deepen our appreciation for the Salt Lake Temple and inspire us to make temple worship a more meaningful part of our daily lives. Mary Jane and Mark, welcome to the Cedar Fort podcast.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
I'm anxious to talk about your book. First of all, I love the temple. And anything that's going to talk about the temple and how great it is and the stories about the temple, I'm already hooked. This is a wonderful book, and it's a creation of a lot of information. And there's some things there I learned as I didn't know. For example, in our pre-show, when we were just warming up here, I remarked that I didn't know there was a time when temple recommends were signed by the temple president.
Yeah.
So I found that very, very interesting. So how did this book come about?
Well, as a church, we commemorate and we celebrate. And as they are anticipating the reopening of the Salt Lake Temple, we wanted to do something in celebration of that momentous event and occasion. And so this is really a celebration of that edifice and the celebration of those people that have, as we said in the introduction, President Woodruff, as he dedicated the temple, gave some promises. And this volume is showing people who have received those promises and attending the Salt Lake Temple.
Yeah, and I could just add to that. There's just been such a focus in President Nelson's ministry on the temple that it just seems so appropriate. Like Mary Jane said, now the hopes were that this book was going to be released as the temple was opening. We didn't know it was going to come out. We don't want to say a year early, but because I know that there was a moving target of when the temple would actually open. But the idea was that this would coincide with the opening of the temple. So maybe it's a good thing that it's out in advance so people can have a chance to read it before the temple opens.
Yes, I think it's a great idea. I think this makes a great, I always use the word coffee table book.
Right.
But to just have it sitting there, because this is a type of book that you could just open up just about any page and just start reading.
No necessary for that, right, Mary Jane? No chronological order on that.
Yeah, and the chapters don't build upon one another. They are separate, standalone chapters. Some of them,
Yes.
are a quick read. Some of them take a few more minutes, but as you said, it's a book that you can put down and pick up, and you don't have to remember where you were. You have a
Yes.
totally new subject with each chapter.
Yes. Now, if I remember right, you got 3 sections, or is it 4 sections? It's got 4 sections.
Yes.
I'm looking at your manuscript here now. What I'd
We
like to do, what I'd like to do is take the first section, the building and renovation of the Salt Lake Temple, and have each of you share just a little tidbit of that section that appeals to you, that you really like.
I will always
So,
defer to
Mark,
Mary Jane.
well, we always defer to the sisters.
Right, and I will build on whatever she says or try to follow
Okay.
her.
Well,
All right.
the first section is talking about the building of the Salt Lake Temple originally, and interesting stories that have to do with that. And I think one of the greatest stories is one that Mark wrote on John R. Moyle. And so I think having him cover just that chapter to give you a little taste of what this section has in it, it would be great.
Yeah, and so I can just tell you, Richard, years ago, I was the bishop of our ward in the Dallas area, and we were traveling from Dallas to a bowl game at BYU. Sorry, BYU versus whoever in the Las Vegas Bowl, which meant stopping in St. George for a day or two and seeing some friends. And we went to the visitor center, and in about 2008 or 2009, they were showing the movie in the St. George Temple Visitor Center only as a stonecutter. And that was my first exposure to that story. And as a bishop, I thought, you know what? I want the youth in our ward to have the experience of walking to the Dallas Temple. Now, luckily, we had some great sisters in our ward who said walking, the 20 miles plus to the Dallas Temple in the middle of Dallas, going through stoplights and crosswalks is probably not the greatest idea. So we shortened it to a 10-mile walk down a beltway, and then we did the 20-mile walk later. But that's how that story got into my heart and mind at first. And then to be able to read about it and to recognize that both President Uchtdorf and Elder Holland told that story in General Conference about John R. Moyle's walk to the temple, I think just made it such a significant story that teaches us about consecration and commitment and dedication, and to see what sacrifices the saints were willing to make to contribute to the building of the temple that was definitely a story that we wanted to make sure made it into the book in this section.
One of my favorite chapters is by our dear colleague McLean Eward, and he looked at the actual building of the Salt Lake Temple. And of course, that took 4 decades, 40 years. Yeah. And he just took it step by step chronologically and showed. One of my favorite passages that McLean writes about is, of course, we had the original foundation, and then in 1857 we had the Utah War, where they had to cover it and get out of Dodge somewhat. And as they came back and found that there was some crumbling and some problems with the original foundation, this statement, I think, just leads to the whole book and the whole reason we're having the renovation. Wilford Woodruff recorded in his journal that President Young said, "I expect this temple will stand through the millennium, and the brethren will go in and give the endowments to the people, and this is the reason why I'm having the foundation of the temple taken out." And so you now see President Nelson, I think, preparing that temple for the millennium. As President Young said, it will stand through the millennium, and President Nelson's going to make sure that it does. And so it's just amazing to read through the temple being completed, the whole process of the granite, and the steps in originally creating that flagship temple.
Yeah, I think the building of that, taking 40 years, is really something. And how many times they started over, and as you said, there was the war, and I like that term, getting out of Dodge. And It just took 40 years, and now we've got temples just springing up everywhere, and it's just marvelous. I served 18 years as an ordinance worker in 3 different temples, and the Redlands Temple was one of the first small ones made. It's in California, and I've been in stake centers that are larger than that temple.
Wow.
But it was a wonderful blessing for the people in the area, and it's just wonderful to see these temples go up. I had a friend, her father has a map with all the temples, and he looked at the map with all the pins in just the Utah Valley. And he said there are more temples in the Utah Valley than there were when he served a mission.
Wow.
And it's just marvelous. And when I lived in the Utah Valley, now I'm building a home up here in North Ogden, so this is where I live. But there in the Utah Valley, when one temple closed for cleaning, we were 20 minutes from 5 different temples.
Oh, wow.
And and I remember I lived in Israel for 4 years, and the closest temple was the Swiss temple. And there's no way I could afford to even get on a plane to go to the temple, much less do anything else. And so I think it's so wonderful. I was just reading this morning, West Africa, I can't remember which country, but one of our apostles was there and dedicating that temple. And so wonderful, the people. Yes, people throughout the world now are able to get to temples, and it's just growing and growing. I think it's wonderful. Well,
Richard, I think
yes,
that leads us right to another section that we have, which is we have a section on temple workers' experiences in the Salt Lake Temple.
yes,
And there are some favorites. Mine is there is a man by the name of Ned Winder who became rather famous because he sealed 4,000 couples in the Salt Lake Temple
wow,
and truly became known as Marrying Ned Winder. And people requested him, and this went on for 35 years. And his grandson writes this chapter about his experiences, and it's wonderful to read about this wonderful man who sealed so many couples and started their relationships in the Salt Lake Temple.
yeah, it's quite an honor to be able to do that. My father-in-law, he's passed, but made it into his 90s. But he was a temple sealer, and everybody in the family, grandchildren and great grandchildren, they would let him know well in advance so he could get the letter of approval and go to the temple where they're at. It's really a wonderful blessing. You got one here.
We also have two temple presidents and matrons, and I think it's really important. We have the final temple president before it closed, which was President Jackson and Rosemary Wixom. And they talk about that last day when they closed the temple and looking forward to the renovation. And so they kind of close out the chapter of the temple before it's renovated. Along with them, we have Milton and Catherine Hinckley Walker, who actually wrote a book about their experiences as temple president and matron. And we've taken some wonderful excerpts from their work and included it here as they talk about their experiences and how they tried to help patrons really worship in the temple in unique ways.
You've got one called At the Recommend Desk. Mark, can you say something about that?
Well, that's I don't know if I'm looking right at that one. That's not the one by Sam Lefevre, right? That's another one, right?
I've got to go. I've got to go to that page.
I've got one called.
It's on page. I have page 167 here.
It's by Sam.
Is that by Sam as well?
Yeah, that is. He has two.
Yeah. No, it was just really interesting to read what Sam has written here, and really it's kind of cool to show that there are many members of the church, ordinary rank and file members, that are having these special, great, sacred experiences in the temple. And I think Sam does a great job of highlighting the idea that that there are experiences that would be just monumental in the lives of members of the church, ordinary members of the church, that are having these, what I would call just these sacred experiences in the temple. I don't know, Mary Jane, if you have anything more to add to that, but
he talks about being at the recommend desk and patrons coming in and experiences that he was able to share with them.
Right.
And sometimes I think even unbeknownst to the patron, but as he observed, people entering the temple and the Spirit working on them, and he shares some amazing experiences that he had.
And even with members of the 12, right, as they come into the temple, and to see their affection for members of the church, and just some of those, the sharing of love with everyone, was a memorable experience that Brother Lefevre talked about.
Well, let's jump back to another section here. You got patrons' personal experiences in the temple. I know that me personally, I have had some wonderful, wonderful experiences within the temple. And not just necessarily being in an endowment session, but just being in the temple and spending time in the celestial room. What would be a favorite of yours in that section, Mark?
Okay, now this is all going to be edited, right, Richard? We can edit some of these things out.
Well, I can edit anything you want.
Okay, good. Because I don't have one. I mean, I don't have one right off the top of my head.
Okay.
I did think that the baby born in the Salt Lake Temple was a really cool story. I remember talking with Mary Jane about that because we had heard that. This was one of the stories that we had heard and we had heard about, but wasn't sure it was documented, and we had heard different variations of it. So this was an attempt to really lock down some history and to say, okay, we want the details of this experience. And so that was one that stands out to me, but I don't have any specific details. You, Mary
Okay.
Jane?
One of my favorites we shared is from President Eyring, and he shared this in conference, but he talked about when he was BYU eyes, I guess it was Rick's at the time, and the Teton Dam
Oh, yeah.
ex- disaster. I don't know why that was a tongue twister for me. And he talked about, if you remember, he said, I testify that as we attend the temple, we can be reminded of the eternal nature of our spirits and that all will be well because of temple covenants. And that was the message that he had for his wife as she was worried about their daughter who was in the trail of the dam, water coming down, and talked about all is well because of temple covenants. And I also have a personal experience that I wrote about in the book that I had in the Salt Lake Temple. And it was a time, I won't go into the details because I want people to get the book and read about it, but for me, it was a time when, of all things, I had the Spirit withdraw while I was in the temple.
Mm.
Felt what that was like. And there are some reasons the Lord blessed me with that experience. I don't want to ever have it again, but that was a personal experience I had in the Salt Lake Temple that reinforced my testimony, as it did for all of these people that we included their personal experiences.
Richard, I have one that I could share. I just don't know what your time frame is, but if we're sharing,
No, go ahead.
share a brief one. Because one of Mary Jane and I's colleagues, Craig Osler, wrote a great chapter in this section that we're referring to right now about personal experiences. And this was an experience I think he had as a bishop. Was a bishop of a BYU student ward at the time, and there was some kind of meeting that was called actually in the assembly hall of the Salt Lake Temple back in the mid 1990s. And one of the things he told that I thought was really interesting, as all these bishops and stake presidents gathered together for this meeting, was that President Hinckley started. They were told to be there really early, and President Hinckley ends up starting the meeting an hour early, which I thought was interesting. And then he just shared this cool experience that, if you don't mind, I can read it really quick. But he said,
Yes.
Elders Neil A. Maxwell and David B. Haight, you can imagine having two apostles, administered the sacramental prayers. Elder Maxwell offering the prayer on the bread and Elder Haight on the water. And I recall this particular detail because at the time Elder Haight was blind and offered the prayer from memory. And in doing so, he made an error in the revealed wording of the prayer. And I'm confident that I was not the only one in the meeting to notice, because as bishops, we are responsible for presiding over the blessing of the sacramental emblems in our individual wards, which included ensuring that the wording of the prayers were exact. Somewhat to my amazement, President Hinckley did not correct Elder Haight or ask him to offer the prayer a second time. I thought then, have since, the lesson taught earlier regarding grace for another's errors in a moment of sincerity, especially in the temple. And then I just think how fitting it is that Elder Maxwell and Haight actually pass away almost at the same time years later. And that's where we get Elder President Udorf or Elder Udorf and Elder Bednar. But just a great little. It's amazing how much you can learn as we just observe our leaders. They don't even have to say anything. We're just watching in action. And there's one of those great stories.
Yeah, it's very true. They teach us by example. Absolutely. Now,
There's also another personal experience, and again, it's Elder Eyring's. It's interesting to me, of course, when they filmed the videos for The Living Christ in the year 2000, they told the 12 in the First Presidency, I don't know who they is, but you can go anywhere you want in the world to be filmed. And of course, Elder Maxwell went to the Hubble telescope. President Nelson is in front of the Visitor Center and the Christus. But Elder Eyring wanted the Salt Lake Temple to be his place where he filmed it. And he said an amazing thing. If you watch that, we've got his testimony transcribed. He said, the first time I walked just a few feet in the temple, I had the feeling I had been here before. In an instant, the thought came to me that what I recognized was a sense of peace beyond anything I had felt before in this life, but that I seemed to recognize and almost remember. We knew our Heavenly Father and His beloved Son before we came into this life. We felt peace with them then, and we longed to be with them again, with our families and those we love. And then he talks about the peace he felt in the Salt Lake Temple.
yes.
And I think that's just indicative of what everyone feels and what they had felt. You know, it's a place, especially the Salt Lake Temple, where that peace comes.
Yes, I love the temple, as I said before. I love just being in there. If I had my way, I'd just stay the whole time. But I've got other things that I have to also do. In your book, I've really enjoyed you've got some drawings. I'm looking at one now. Shows the outside of the temple, and it shows the soil and shoring walls removed, and shows a little model of a person there. And this is an interesting chapter. It's really interesting to see how they're shoring it up, like Mary Jane, you said, that President Nelson is making sure it's going to last through the millennium. And so to me, it's a marvelous engineering feat. As I've watched it, the foundation almost basically being suspended, basically, and then see what they've done. It's just, I can't even imagine how the engineers came up with it, but it's...
That chapter is especially great because we had one of the professors of civil and construction engineering, James Smith at BYU, who was involved. And he gives us that perspective that we wouldn't have gotten anywhere else.
There's no way anyone in our religion department could have done what James Smith did. And I agree with Mary Jane. I actually believe this is maybe one of the most significant contributions in the whole book, because it even though they kind of explain, not they, but in general conference, President Nelson kind of explained and others what was going to be done to the Salt Lake Temple. This is like, I don't know if there's any more detail anyone would ever be able to find on the specifics of what they have been doing for the last 5 or 6 years. Mary Jane, how many years now? Yeah. And it's just, I think it's astonishing and it's a marvel. If anyone knows much about the rebuilding of the Provo, city center temple, I think this is, equals that in terms of just complexity and every detail, whatever it would take to make that temple withstand an earthquake and just shore it up like they've done. And then, like Mary Jane and I talked about earlier, then their great spiritual parallels of how all of that applies to our own personal lives. We would recommend that chapter. Maybe it's the last chapter, but maybe that's where they start, because it's fascinating.
Well, it's interesting that this temple is being establishing like a firm foundation, and the prophet at the same time is asking us to spiritually do that. That we need to be studying the scriptures daily. We need to be going to the temple as often as we can, as our circumstances allow. I try to listen to a conference talk every morning, and this morning I can't remember which one I was listening to, but um, he mentioned the temple several times. And I go, I've really got to look at how many times the word temple was mentioned in the last general conference. I'm going to have to do a search on it because I'm hearing it more and more. And where they're just saying you need to go as often as your circumstances allow. And I've approached this to various people. Are couples really understanding the importance of it? And maybe as you start off the month, look at the calendar and try to work it out. And it's difficult. There's single mothers and there are those that are ill. And I attend the Ogden Temple, and I see a man there that's in a wheelchair and he has no legs, and just think of what he went through to just get there, and to be able to engage in those things. And I just encourage young couples, regardless of how many children you have. I was at an affair yesterday, a family affair down in Salt Lake, and one of our family members, I said, she's like right next to the Leighton Temple. I mean, like 2 minutes away. And I said, how's it having it so close? And she looked at me like, I can't go. I'm having trouble going. I said, well, what's the problem? She said, well, she has 2 boys, and she's married a man his first wife died of cancer, and he had 4 children, if I believe right. And together they've now had 2 children. And one of the children she says, I had him at an activity this morning, and I lost him twice. You take your eyes off him, he's gone. You don't blink. And even at that family gathering, which was all in a yard and enclosed, she just was almost by him to keep an eye on him. And I said, what about your teenage daughters? And he said, well, one's got POTS. I didn't know what POTS was, but evidently it's something where you can just pass out. And the other has autism.
Oh, wow.
And then the one that just came back from the temple is working a full-time job and goes to the temple on Saturday. And so I told her, I said, she's about half hour from us. I said, Jesse, just call my wife and I. We're retired. We'll come and we'll watch the children. You and your husband go to the temple. And she said, it would take 2 of you to watch those 2 boys. She said, they're so rambunctious. I don't know if she'll ever call us because she probably thinks we're not qualified to watch 2 boys. But I just wanted her to know that I'll do everything I can to help you get to the temple.
Sure. That's great.
Yeah.
The last section is my favorite. And I think one of the most important reasons we wrote the book or compiled it, and that is on the principles and doctrines of the temple. And I think, Richard, that's why you want that young mother there, is not just to attend the temple, but to understand the doctrines and the principles that are taught there.
Yeah.
And this is an amazing compilation. You have 2 of our colleagues write about 2 very important subjects that aren't written about very much. Alonzo Gaskell, who I think is the greatest person on temple symbolism that we have.
Yes, I've read his book several times. Yes.
He's amazing. Talks about the Holy of Holies. And I don't know of another article that traces the Holy of Holies and talks about that doctrine. And then we have one of our colleagues who's emeritus, Andrew Skinner, who's a brilliant scholar, talk about the sealing power and what we learn in the temple about the sealing powers. So those 2, the book is worth just those 2 chapters in understanding that doctrine.
I would agree. And I love Mary Jane. I love Leah Darby's contribution there on Elder Talmage's writing Jesus the Christ in the Salt Lake Temple and kind of clarifying any misconceptions that we may have heard over the years of did he really sleep in the temple and did he some of these other things. But it was quite an interesting process to watch of how he really did eat, sleep, and drink. When he wasn't doing his other apostolic duties, he was writing Jesus the Christ, and he was reading portions of it to the First Presidency for their approval. And what an incredible contribution that chapter is for all those who have read Jesus the Christ in their life and they want to know the background of how that really came to be. I thought another great chapter.
And one of my favorites, of course, is the Lorenzo Snow
Yeah.
experience of seeing Jesus Christ. And you know,
Yes.
when I was little growing up, we used to have the warbly ladies sing, "I walked today where Jesus walked." And I always say, well, I can't maybe walk where Jesus walked, but I can tell you where he stood.
Yeah.
With Lorenzo Snow.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of precursor to Lorenzo having Christ appear to him. But
Yes.
maybe I can just give little snippets.
Yeah.
Lorenzo did not want to be the prophet. Can you blame him?
I don't want to be the prophet.
No. As Wilford gets sick, they take him to San Francisco, and Lorenzo starts praying like crazy, you know, that Wilford will make it. And when he passes away, and I'm of course paraphrasing, Lorenzo was told in his patriarchal blessing he could raise people from the dead, and he did. I can give you a
Yes.
couple names, Ella Jensen and others that he raised. And so I'm paraphrasing, but he will go into the Holy of Holies and say, Heavenly Father, how about one more? How about I raise, you know, when Wilford's body gets back, I raise him from the dead and he can continue to being a great prophet. And
Right.
the body's on its way back to the depot and, you know, nothing happens. And so he walks out of the Holy of Holies through the celestial room. And I hope this remains the same, because in the celestial room in the Salt Lake Temple, there was a very low table with a very tall, almost tall as me, vase, and some frosted doors, and that's where the Holy of Holies is. So Lorenzo will walk out of the Holy of Holies, walk out of the celestial room, come into the hall, and he's walking past the terrestrial room, and he's just about ready to turn and go down this landing of stairs. And so I'm hoping we're going to keep that, because I know where Christ stood.
Yeah.
And he hears something behind him, and it's Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he says,
Yeah.
no, I want you to go ahead. And that is where the point where we start doing secession like the Lord wants us to.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I once went to a Mormon History Association meeting where they were trying to prove this didn't happen.
Oh, wow.
And I know it
Okay.
happened.
First of all, how can you prove something doesn't happen?
Well, they were giving it their best shot. And,
I was taught in school. You can't prove a negative.
well, they were doing their best.
They were doing their best, weren't they?
We know, I'll tell you why I know that this happened. And this comes from, we don't know this happened because Lorenzo told us, but his granddaughter was a blabbermouth. And her name was Allie Snow Young Pond. And she said, I was walking several steps ahead of Grandpa in the Salt Lake Temple when he stopped me and he said, wait a minute, Allie, I want to tell you something. It was right here, that spot that I identified, that the Lord Jesus Christ appeared to me at the time of the death of President Woodruff. He instructed me to go right ahead and reorganize the First President of the Church at once and not wait as had been done before with the previous presidents, and that I was to succeed President Woodruff. Then Grandpa came up a step nearer, held out his left hand and said, he stood right here, about 3 feet above the floor. It looked as though he stood on a plate of solid gold. Grandpa told me what a glorious personage the Savior is and described, now watch this, his hands, his feet, his countenance, and his beautiful white robes. Now, why do I know that happened? If I was going to describe somebody to you, if I was going to describe Mark, I'd tell you that he is about 5'8". Am I right, Mark? Close?
So close,
That
Mary
he-
Jane. 5'7". I want to be 5'8" one
Okay.
day.
That he's got brown eyes and he's experienced what some people do with their hair, men. And but I would never, in describing Mark, talk about what his hands and his feet look like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Well, why did President Snow share that?
Yeah.
because he's talking about those marks of the crucifixion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you
Wow.
get that, and that to me is a bookend with the other incredible experience we have in the Salt Lake Temple, another revelatory experience, and of course that is the revelation that gave all worthy males the priesthood with President Kimball.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
President Kimball will talk about the steps he took to receive that revelation, and the steps he took happened in the temple as he went
Yes.
day after day after day to the temple. And
Yeah.
he tells us how he prayed and what he prayed. And so just those two experiences alone bring the Salt Lake Temple as the premier flagship temple of the church.
No
Well,
question.
I hope that as those that listen to this podcast can feel the spirit, as I'm feeling right now. I'm very touched. Whenever we talk about the temple in a reverent manner, the spirit's always there. I appreciate the two of you taking the time from your busy schedules and spending some time with me as we talk about this. And I have the manuscript here in front of me. I'm also an author with Cedar Fort, and as I do these interviews, they send me the manuscripts, and I don't have to buy the book. But this is a book that I am going to buy, and it is going to go on our coffee table. In fact, I have a son from Iowa. He's come with his family. In fact, they'll be here this afternoon, and I'll be in the Ogden Temple with him on Thursday. And right across from there is a Deseret Books. And is it in Deseret Books already?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
it is.
I'm going to go in Deseret Books and get a copy, not only for me but for my son and his family, because
That's
I think
great.
I think it's an ideal book for children too, for parents to read these stories to their children.
Yeah, you bet.
So I thank you again for your time, and I assume well, it's obviously at Cedar Fort. They can be ordered there. It's is it on Amazon also? I assume it is.
I'm just
Yeah.
looking right now. Yeah,
I,
there
I
it
think
is.
it is. Yeah, you bet.
Yes.
Okay, it's on Amazon, and then it's in Deseret Books. So I encourage people to go and get that book and put it on their table, and it helps to keep the temple in our minds. Of course, we have pictures on our walls at the temple, but here's something that we can read a little bit about how important the temple is in our lives. So I just want to thank you very much, and I hope the two of you have a great day.
Our pleasure.
Thank you so much, Richard. Good to be with you.